was a setup like masterclass. If you're new here and not from my previous channel, my name is Demetrius, and a lot of people don't know that I've been studying Byzantine history for about probably almost 15 years now. And I've always wanted to talk about it, and I think now's a good time to do it. Usually in Byzantine studies, you'll get two camps, right? When it comes to Byzantine identity. You'll have that they weren't Romans, they were Greeks, or that they were Romans, full stop. Now, I'm definitely a part of the they were Romans, full stop camp, but it's not exactly what a lot of people say or believe that the Romans were. One video came up in particular that I definitely thought I should respond to, and it's from Romaboo Ramblings. Now, I love his channel. He talks about Roman history, both classical and medieval. And he did a video called, Should We Use the B Word? Byzantium, right? And in that video, he said a lot of things that honestly shocked me. And one of them was this.
The outsiders, barring certain important exceptions, also acknowledged the Romanness of the Byzantines. Arabic, Persian, Slavic, and even early Frankish historians all called the Byzantines by some exonym derived from Rome. Calling them Greeks began only after the split between Constantinople and the papacy in the 8th century. This was a political trick employed by the Western European powers, who had a specific political agenda in challenging the Eastern Empire's claim to the legacy of ancient Rome. The Byzantines themselves saw it for what it was, and naturally hated it. When papal emissaries came to Nicephorus Phocas addressing him as the Emperor of the Greeks, he threw them in jail.
So basically what he's saying is that everyone saw them as Roman. They used an exonym for Roman, from at least before the Franks started using Greek instead of Roman, and that was around the late 8th century. Generally, we could say even Christmas Day of 800 AD is a very particular and important date, but that's a myth. It's a complete myth.
It's totally made up. Pure fiction. Not this time. It never happened.
He does mention that it's an exception. We're going to see that that is absolutely not the case. And we're going to go through thoroughly all of the neighbors and the people who came in contact with the Byzantines, and we are going to see what they called them. First-hand sources are definitely used the most, and then secondary sources. What I did is I went through all the first-hand sources I could, then I looked up the professors and the leading academics within those fields of those particular peoples and saw their conclusions, and they all matched up with what my research showed, which doesn't show any skill of mine, but just how easy it is to verify this and see that a lot of what he said was very false or completely. So we're going to go from west to east and see what the Westerners outside of the Franks called them, because we know the Franks changed it from Emperor of the Romans to Emperor of the Greeks. And then we're going to go east and see what they called them and what they meant by the words that they called them. Of all the Germanic people, the Goths are very important because they're an Eastern Germanic tribe, right? And they came in a lot of contact with the Romans. They used Rumones to mean Roman. I'm probably totally butchering the pronunciation of these. Forgive me in advance for totally butchering it. The only accent I'm really fluent in is Greek. Outside of that, no. So forgive me. I could be wrong, but I think the only place this word is found is in the Codex Ambrosianus A. It basically says something of the lines of, this is the end of Romans, and we go now into the Corinthians, letter of the Corinthians. So there are two words in Gothic for which they translate the word Greek, or Hellene, Hellenes, right, in Greek. And that's Hythno, or Hythno, and Kreks. Now, Hythno or Hythno, it's obvious for what that means because it's a Germanic language just like English. And that word is heathen. Hythno means heathen, right? And we only find this word in Mark chapter 7, verse 26. And so it's only in the feminine noun, right? It's only in the feminine case. We don't know what the masculine or the neutral is. So we basically know Gothic from the Gospels and the Bible and Scripture. And Ulfius was an Arian bishop from Cappadocia, and he was Greek natively, or spoke Greek natively, and he learned Latin and Gothic and translated all the Gospels, right? And he invented the Gothic alphabet, and that's why it looks a lot like the Greek alphabet, right? So he knew and understood the context when the word Hellenes meant pagan, because if you know, in the Byzantine Empire, a lot of times, most of the times, at least in the middle period, early and middle period, Hellenes means pagan. It's synonymous for pagan, right? So he knew when it meant a pagan versus when it meant an ethnic Greek person, right? And so for the other times, he uses GREEKS. Now, GREEKS means Greek, and it's from Proto-West Germanic, Greco, which comes from the Latin Graecus, or at this time, Graecus, right? The G in Graecus becomes a K, GREEKS, right? Greco. And then it again becomes a G in most modern Germanic languages with a few exceptions. So if you see that, that's more of a medieval period thing. Now, what they call the Eastern Romans, the Byzantines, is a mystery, okay? We really don't know. All we have are the Gospels mainly. And it's unfortunate, though, because Gothic did survive in Crimea up to like the 18th century, but unfortunately we have like no writings. We only have a few words in Crimean Gothic that we can pull from, and those aren't included, and it's a real bummer because obviously Crimea was a part of the Byzantine Empire, and there's Greeks been living there since antiquity, even up till now, so they would have come in contact with them and would have had an appropriate word for them. And a lot of these Crimean Goths were bilingual, and they spoke Gothic and Greek, so it's a real disappointment, but we don't have anything. Now, the Nords are interesting because they're obviously a northern people, but they're not part of the Franks. And they obviously, in the form of the Varangians, were guards starting with Emperor Basil II. So they helped the emperor, and they were personal bodyguards of him. So we know that the Franks denied the Roman rule and the Roman identity of the Romans, the Byzantines. But what about the Nords? What about the Varangians? What did they call them? Well, we actually know it's literally written in stone, and it's in rune stones all over Sweden generally that talk about the Varangians that went to the Byzantine Empire, fought, and sometimes died. They all say Grekland, which means Greece, Greek land, and Grikyar, Greeks, all of them. And this is well documented. It's not debated by scholars or anything. So this, outside of the Franks, they do 100%, no one really denies, called them Greeks in their land, Grekland. But because they came in contact with them mainly during the reign of Basil II, so that's in the 10th century, right, is where they first really make contact, you would think that naturally that the word Grikyar came from the Franks, right, and Graecus, right, the Latin term. But actually, no. So the older Germanic words that came from the Latin Graecus, right, are Kre. K-R-E, if we're going to spell it in English, right? K-R-E. And the reason for this is because at this time, ecclesiastical Latin changed the diphthong, just like in Greek, the alpha iota, the A-E changed from a diphthong I to a monophthong E. So now instead of Graecus, it's Graecus, right? So that's why it became Kre, like Graecus, right? Greco. Old Norse, it's Grikkar. So it's not E, it's E or I. And where does this spelling actually come from? Believe it or not, it's the Slavs. Romabu writes Romei for the Rus and implies that it was used by the Slavs before the 8th century. A few things wrong here. The Rus never used the word Romei, ever. The East Slavic word for Roman is Rimsky. Rimsky, it's like Rim. It looks like Rimsky, not Romei. As a matter of fact, the word Romei isn't even a Slavic word at all. It's a modern transliteration of the Greek word for Romans, right? And in English, we pronounce it Romaioi, but in modern Greek, it's Romei. And this is spelled Romei. And the only time I ever found this word in Cyrillic letters, Romei, was in Russian and Bulgarian texts. And for the Russian one, it said in parentheses, Romei, right next to the Greek Romei. So it's basically saying this is a transliteration of that word. And the same with Bulgarians. When you look up Byzantine studies, they say Romei today, believe it or not, because it's a modern transliteration of how it's pronounced today. And we know it's modern because the oi in Greek was pronounced oi, Today it's pronounced E, but in the medieval period at this time, it was pronounced U. It's in between U and E. U, just like the letter Ypsilon was pronounced Ypsilon, right? And we know for a fact that it was pronounced this way all the way past the 11th century, because Michael the grammarian in, I believe it's around 1030, he writes a poem and he makes fun of a man for confusing U with E. And obviously that's for the letter Ypsilon, but it really seems like they both changed at the same time. It was a phonetic change. And we even see this in the Chalatar inscription. There's a lot of grammatical errors, and they usually confuse Omicron iota with Ypsilon. So at this point, it would be pronounced Romeu, right? And they would probably transliterate it, just like the letter Ypsilon, they transliterate it as U. So it would be Romeu if they were doing a transliteration at that time. So this is a modern transliteration. The word has never been used.
We made it up.
So what word did they use? Well, the Rus' first encounter with the Romans is likely the raids of Propondis and Paphlagonia. And this raid is mentioned only once in one Greek 10th century manuscript on the life of St. George Amastoris, where St. George miraculously appears and protects the people of Amastoris from the raids of the Rus after they tried to desecrate his tomb. They tried to take his tomb. So St. George of Amastoris died in either 802 to like 807, around there. So this is obviously has to be after he died. So there's some who think, a few who think it happened immediately after he died, this raid. Some actually think it happened in like the 940s during the Rus-Byzantine Wars. A lot of people tend to put it around just randomly at 830 AD. But we know for sure the very first official encounter that we know with the Rus is the Siege of Constantinople in 860. That is at least the earliest confirmed contact with the Rus and the Romans. And this is obviously after the West changed from Romans to Greeks as the name for the Byzantines. But the biggest issue here is that Cyrillic wasn't even invented until the 9th century, and it was only used by the Rus in the 10th century. They used the Glagolitic alphabet a little before that period that they used the Cyrillic, but not by much. And the word they use is never Roman. It never is. Cyril and Methodius, who were Greeks or Romans from Thessaloniki, they invented the Glagolitic alphabet and they spread it among the Slavs. And here's an important part. Those two were born and passed in the 9th century. So this is after that point. But they were trying to beat the West in converting the Slavs, because this is already when religious tensions were high between East and West. And St. Cyril and Methodius, being Eastern Romans, they were trying to convert the Slavs away from the influence of the West. So I think that's very important. That says a lot here, because they were trying to get that influence away. The primary chronicle was written by St. Nestor of Kiev during the 1110s, right around there. And it's about the history of the East Slavs and the Rus. So the only word they use for the Romans is Greek. And one of the first passages, it's Idzie Oleg na Greek. That is the only word that you will see, and it's used throughout the Chronicle. It's Greek. It's not Rimski or anything like that. I couldn't find any mention of Rimski. The word for Greek was the only word used by the Rus to describe the Eastern Romans, the Byzantines. And this is actually confirmed by one of the leading Rus scholars, Simon Franklin, in his work, Greek in Kievan Rus. In this work, he's figuring out how much of the Greek language the Rus knew, because some scholars said they knew none, some said they were all familiar with Greek, and he wanted to see what that was. So he looked for the word for the language, and that was Greek. That was the only word he found. Nothing saying Rimski, nothing saying Roman, just the word for Greek. And he said the overwhelming majority of the words that described Greek meant the peoples and not the language. Now, I'm going to come back to Simon Franklin and the Rus at the very end, and it's extremely important to knowing the full context of this. And it blew my mind when reading this. So it will with you, so stay tuned for that. He also writes, a late version of the 12th century life of Leonti of Rostov relates how the saint was, and this is the quote, born and raised in Tsargrad meaning Constantinople. He knew well both the language of the Rus and the language of the Meria, and he was a skilled interpreter of the Rus and Greek books. Now, in the notes, Franklin writes that Meria was from the reading Mirski. It says, the text in Predania gives Mirski, which it would be tempting, but probably incorrect to amend it to Rimski of the Romaioi. When he says it's probably incorrect, I don't think so. I think it does say Rimski because it would make sense. He knew well both the language of the Rus and the language of the Romans, and he was skilled interpreter of the Rus and Greek books. That to me makes way more sense. What else is Meria going to be? But then again, I don't have access to the originals like he does, and he is a professional in this, so I'm just going to leave it blank. I'm not going to agree with him, but I'm not going to completely disagree. So if it is the word Rimski, it would be the only one we have, and it's certainly not Romei. Now, it wasn't just the Rus that called the Romans Greeks. It was also the Bulgars. Now, obviously, the Bulgars, the leading Bulgars, right? The ruling class was not Slavic speaking. They were Turkic speakers, right? But we have the Chalatar inscription from the Bulgarian Khan Omurtag, and he ruled from 815 to 831, and it's written in Greek. It says a lot. I'm just going to give you where it's important. Tin dinamintus istus Greekus ke sklavus ke techneos, so on and so forth. And so it says, Kanasubigi Omurtag, in the land where he was born is Lord by God. In the field of Pliska, staying he made an owl at Ticha, and moved his forces against the Greeks and the Slavs, and skillfully erected a bridge at Ticha together with camp. According to Uwe Fielder, and it's in a book called The Others, Europe in the Middle Ages, Avars, Bulgars, Khazars, and Cumans, East, Central, and Eastern Europe in the Middle Ages, 450 to 1450, long title. He says that Greek was the official language of the Bulgar Empire before it was changed to Old South Slavic, okay? And that the inscriptions were written at that time in the colloquial Greek of the time, not like with the Byzantines where official writings were in a type of Attic Greek, right? So this is Greek devoid of Atticism, mimesis, or Byzantine propaganda, as you would call it, right? This is just what the people, everyday people spoke. It was also written by someone who was learned enough because they were literate. So whoever wrote this believed Greek to be the appropriate word to describe the Romans. And this, I think, says a lot. It's one of the few areas where we have Greek written by someone who isn't a part of the Roman Empire. But we even see this in the Second Bulgarian Empire, right? And it doesn't change at all. In the anonymous Bulgarian Chronicle, it's a medieval work which describes events from 1296 to 1417, right? And in there, they use Greek exclusively. They don't use Roman, but they do refer to the land as Romania. And I know that sounds confusing, but that's the native word that the Romans themselves used. It was Romais or Romania. And obviously it has nothing to do with modern Romania. That was at the time called Wallachia, or the people of the Vlachs. That was the name for Romanians. So I know it's confusing, but Romania just means in Greek, basically, land of the Romans. So the Bulgarians do call the land Romania, but the people Greeks. And they also do this. This isn't just this chronicle that does this. There's in the Church of the 40 Martyrs, there's a column, right? And it has the inscriptions of one of the Bulgarian Tsar's victories, the Turnovo column inscription. And it commemorates the victory at Klokotnitsa, oh, that's a mouthful, on March 9th, 1230. And this is from Tsar Ioan Asen II. And as we're seeing this, right, we see right here the word Romania and then Grčkia and Romania. If we translate it, it says, I went to war in Romania and defeated the Greek army and captured their Tsar, Kyr Theodore Komnenos, together with all his boyars. And I conquered all of his land from Odrin, Adrianople, to Drak, Dyrrhachion, Greek, and also Albanian and Serbian. So no matter what, the Bulgarians always call the Romans Greeks, right? And they don't have the political incentive to say they are not Romans, right? They're not trying, unlike the West, to usurp the Roman Empire for themselves and call themselves Romans. They don't have that. So there's no incentive to not call them Romans, but they still decided always to call them Greeks, even though they refer to their land as Roman land. So for the Bulgars, Grekos in Greek doesn't just mean Greeks in Greece, like Romabu mentioned. He said that Grekos just meant the people or the Greeks living in Greece.
Greek or Grekos was used informally, mainly to refer to people who came from the region of Greece. In this context, it can't be juxtaposed with the Roman, because it is a regional identity.
That's absolutely not the case.
It's fiction.
At least with the Bulgars, and we'll see later, probably in another video, that it wasn't the case with the Byzantines themselves either. Now, a lot of people will mention the Bulgarian Tsar Scholeion, who was called the Roman Slayer, right? And it's like, oh, he was called the Roman Slayer, so they called them Romans. But this isn't the case. Again, the only mention of Roman Slayer is one work, and that's by George Acropolites. And it was written in Greek by a Roman. So of course he's going to use it.
This one was invented by a writer.
Now, here comes a people that most people always throughout history seem to forget, but they're very important, especially in this period. It's the Georgians. And the Georgians are obviously a very unique people with a completely unique language and customs, food, and even their own alphabet. So in typical Georgian fashion, their word for Byzantines is completely unique. It doesn't derive from anything. It's their own word. So Berdzeni is the people, Saberzneti is the land. The Sa in the beginning means of, right? Eti means land of. So, land of the Berdzeni. Now, a lot of people think Berdzeni comes from the word Pelasgian, you know, the indigenous people of Greece. Some people say it comes from Byzantium, right? The word Byzantine, Byzantium. I think the most probable one is that it comes from Berdzeni. Berdzeni means wise people, philosophers. So it means land of the wise, land of the philosophers. So if you look up the word, at least on Wikipedia, which is never the best idea, you'll see that it's a unique word that refers to, in medieval chronicles, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and the Byzantines. But today it means Greece and Greeks, right? So now I wouldn't just jump to conclusions and say that, oh, it means Greeks because today they use it as Greeks. But if they saw them as Romans, right, then it would mean like a word for Romans, and that they think of the Greeks as Romans. So we're going to look at the medieval chronicles and see exactly what they mean with this word. So we're going to read a lot from the Georgian chronicles. Now, I found an English translation and the original or Georgian manuscript, so we can see both, right? And chapter 3, lines 3, 4, and 5 say, Alexander appeared in Greece, in the country called Macedonia. He was the son of Nictaniba, an Egyptian, as it is written of him in the book of the Greeks. So if we actually look at the Georgian words used, it's Saberzneti and Berdzentasa, right? So that's the words used here. And obviously he wasn't the son of an Egyptian, but that comes, I believe, ultimately from a Syriac legend of Alexander the Great. The Persians had it. Georgians are part of the culture back in the day of Greater Iran, as we called it. This makes sense. Byzantios he gave Greece and Kartli, and allotted him with the northern side. He wrote a letter, his last testament, to Patrick Azon, the Eristawi of Kartli, ordering him to serve Byzantios. Byzantios built the city Byzantium, which is now called Constantinople. So obviously this is true because in Greek legend, King Visas came from Megara, Greece, and he went and built the city of Byzantium named after him, and that is Constantinople. Because yes, Constantinople was built on ancient Greek Byzantium, and even in the medieval period, they usually refer a lot of times to Constantinople as Byzantium, and the locals there, Byzantines. But I'm not pro using the word Byzantine to describe the empire. I'm just using it here because we're talking about their identity. So the author of this chapter is Leonti Mroeli, and he was a Georgian from the 11th century, okay? So he uses Saberzneti to mean ancient Greece and Berdzeni to mean the ancient Greeks. Parnawaz, line 8, we have something interesting. Berdzneta and Hromtasa. And this says, the Greeks could not avenge Parnawaz because they were warring with the Romans. So here we have a word for Romans and Rome, Hromta. And then on King Samurtag, line 21, the Roman Aznauris, or nobles, followed him, and they too came from Durdzuketi. And again, in this we have Hromta. On the 15th kings, Berdzeni and Berdzentagan. And in the English translation, it says, at that time the Armenians and the Greeks were on good terms with each other. And the king of the Armenians, along with the Greek forces, set out to fight the Persians and the Georgians. Now, the funny thing is, this doesn't mean Greeks here. It means Romans, because this is the Roman-Armenian alliance during the reign of Emperor Hadrian. Does this have to do with Hadrian being a Hellenized emperor, right? He dressed in Greek clothing, looked Greek, spoke Greek very fluently, and in his education was Greek? I don't think so. We're going to see why I do not think that's the case. The 24th king, Mirian, son of the king of the Persians, Khosrow. King Mirian continued doing good things for the Georgians and married a Greek from Punt, the daughter of Oligothos, Nana by name. So here it says, Saberdznetit Pontoit. Pontoit means Pondos, right? And scholars generally seem to confirm that this is a Greek woman. He doesn't mean Roman, especially because Pondos was and still is a Greek place. So obviously this means Greek. But look at this. This is this exact same chapter. Mepe Berdzenta. Mepe meaning king. Then line 8. Caesara. Sounds like Caesar. Line 9. Berdzentasa. Line 10. Saberdznet. Line 11. Berdzentasa. Line 12. Berdzenta. So if we read this whole passage all the way to line 17, it says, several years passed and the Khazars came as usual to attack Derbent, as usual. Mirian again sent out to render Derbent aid, and while he fought with the Khazars, the king of the Goths with a countless army invaded Greece. The king of Greece, gathering a great army, set out to meet them. Then the king of the Goths challenged Caesar, king of Greece, to single combat. But Caesar was unable to fight with him. At that time, the son of the Armenian king Khosrow, by the name of Turdat, whom we have mentioned before, was serving in the Greek army. He was brought up in Greece and was a real giant of a man. The Greek army selected him unanimously, and putting on him Caesar's dress and armor, sent him in Caesar's guise to fight the king of the Goths. King of the Goths presented himself, and they rushed against each other. Turdat won combat and turned back the Goths. And Caesar gave an army to Turdat and sent him to Armenia, his own domain. The army entered Armenia and drove away from there the Persian Aristawis of Mirian. So this is clearly here talking about the Romans, and Turdat is Saint Tiridates III of Armenia, okay? And he was, as an infant, raised in Rome and served in the Roman army under Aurelius. So here again, the words Berznuli, Saberdzneti is meant to signify Rome specifically and the Roman Empire. There's no question about it. Both Tiridates and Miriam are saints because they both made Christianity the official religion in both Armenia and Iberia. Iberia, which meant region of Georgia at that time, right? Not Iberia, Spain. Armenia, it happened in 301, and with Iberia, it happened in 337, okay? And this chapter also talks about Constantine and refers to the empire as Saberdzneti. So you would think, okay, this is late in the empire. This is when, the empire was divided and the east meant Greece and stuff, but it still refers to Saberdzneti as Rome proper, right? But you could also say, well, this is around the time they're talking about Constantine, so we're showing an evolution of Latin Roman to Greek Roman, right? But the next chapter talks about Georgia from the exact same period, except it has to do with Saint Nino and her conversion of Iberia. She is the patron saint of Georgia, after all. So this is the exact same time and the exact same author, right? It's just the next chapter. And in that, line 12, it says, Mepisa Romed. He went to Rome to serve the king, or Caesar, and gain favor with him. So here the author Mroeli calls Rome Romed, but in the previous chapter, the same author used Saberdzneti to describe Rome itself. So it's weird, he mixes it up. He uses the word for Caesar with Saberdzneti, but now he uses Mepe, king, and Romed. So a little bit of a mix there. Line 10, and this is now about the history of the Bagratids, and it's written in the 11th century by Sumbat Dawitis Dze. And this is line 10, and it says, Mepeman Berdzentaman. Guram was granted the title of Kuropalatis by the king of the Greeks, who sent him to Mtskheta. And this is around the middle of the empire, right? So this is Byzantine proper. And they always use the word Berdzeni and Saberdzneti to mean the Byzantine Empire. They only use that. They don't use the old Romed, right? But you could say, okay, it tends to mean both, right? Does it mean one more than the other? Okay, so at this point, I'm not focusing on modern Georgian because perceptions change, right? That's different. We're seeing if they saw a connection with the ancient Greeks and the Byzantines. So what we can see is how they described the languages, okay? And for that, we go to Scripture. And the perfect one to see this is Luke 23:38, and it says it was written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. That's what it says in English. So in modern Georgian, it uses Berznuli da Latinuri. And that is obvious because now Berznuli means only the Greek language and Latinuri means Latin. But in Old Georgian, the Old Georgian Gospels, it says Berzulita da Romaya Lebrita. Romaya Lebrita. Rome, Roman language, and Berznulita, the Greek language, okay? So now we can definitely see that, at least when it comes to language, Berznuli Saberneti means Greek much more than it does Latin speakers and Romans. Book of Acts, where it says that Paul went to Greece, right? They don't say that either. They translate it, instead of saying he went to Greece, it says he went away. So we can't have it there. But we do have in John chapter 11, verse 48, this is the King James Version, it says, "If we let him thus alone, all men will believe on him, and the Romans shall come and take away both our place and nation." So this is talking about the Romans. And in modern Georgian, it's Romai Lebi. In Old Georgian, it's Hromni, their word for Rome, with the H in the beginning. So they didn't use a word for Latin, though. They used the Roman language to mean Latin, not Greek. Now we have another very important people that were very close to the Byzantines, and that's the Armenians. They indeed do have a word, horom, to mean Roman, and it was used. So again, they actually did now finally use a proper term for the Byzantines. Now we can see one example, and that's in the book of Letters, and it's a chapter titled this. I am really bad at Armenian, but I do know a little bit, and it says horomots, which means Romans. The t at the end means like the peoples, right? That's like plural. Hais is Armenians. And then we see a word Chalcedoni, which means Chalcedonians, I'm assuming. And that's because the Armenians and the Byzantines, that's where they split, right? The Romans, the Orthodox Church, and the Catholic Church are Chalcedonian Christians. They accept the Council of Chalcedon. The Orientals, the Miaphysites, the Jacobites, whatever you want to call them, they reject the Council of Chalcedon. So obviously this is referring to probably the Orthodox Christians, right? So it says something about letter to the Romans and the Armenians about Chalcedon, right? But they're using the word for Roman. That's important here. And then we see it again, and this is page 553. We see horom, and I think it's saying something like submitting to the ruling rod of the Romans or something, but it still seems to be talking about a religious sense. I don't know Armenian, so any Armenians could translate this stuff, that'd be great. But there's also another word that they use, eunuchs. And now, if you know anything, Yuna comes from Old Persian, Yauna, Yovan, Hebrew, Yunani, and Arabic, right? All those come from, basically, ultimately from the Persian translation of the word for the Ionian tribes in Asia Minor. In Archaic Greek, it was Ionia or Iwonia. That became Yauna in Old Achaemenid Persian, right? And then all the Eastern peoples derived the term for Greeks from the specific tribe. But again, it doesn't mean the specific tribe. It doesn't just mean the Ionians. It's a word to mean all Greeks, but it comes from a particular tribe in East Greece. And so the Armenians use this, and it's eunuchs. And here it says something about a letter to Kagkai, I don't know, Vaspurakani Hayots Tagawari, or Kaisern eunuchs Romanos Vasan Hawatoi. I'm totally butchering that, I know. Forgive me, again, forgive me. So it says something about a letter probably to Kagkai, the Armenian king of Vaspurakan, I'm assuming, to Caesar of the Greeks, Romanos, because Kaisern is Caesar, eunuchs is like of the Greeks, and Romanos. So they're referring to Emperor Romanos as Caesar of the Greeks. And then this letter mentions the word again. You see Kaiser eunuchs. And then there's another letter which uses the Armenian word for Greek, eunuchs. So it seems like the Armenians used Romans and Greeks to describe them. But these are all after the 8th century. So maybe Romabu Ramblings is correct. And the influence of the Franks reached all the way to Armenia, right? It influenced NORDS in the Varangians, the Rus, the Bulgars, the Armenians, the Georgians, right? Well, no. Because here we have, by Paustos Buzan, History of the Armenians. Paustos meaning Faustus, and Buzan probably meaning from Byzantium. At that time, the Armenian nobility sent to some of the great Nakharars with gifts to the king of the Greeks to say that they gave him their hand and that they would serve him obediently were he to support them with aid to obtain revenge from their enemies. Let's see if it actually says that. It says, Ar Tagaworn eunuchs. Tagaworn, king, eunuchs of the Greeks. Guess when this was written? The 5th century. This Armenian letter is from the freaking 5th century, 400s. This is like 100 years after Constantine moved the capital to Constantinople. And already the Armenians are calling him the king of the Greeks. But again, this makes sense. Even in Arabic sources, they say that Constantinople was in the middle of the land of the Greeks because Asia Minor was Greek, right? Anatolia was Greek, just like mainland Greece. So already in the time of Constantine, there's a lot of people speaking Greek in the empire, right? But they call them the king of the Greeks. And no one's getting all freaking mad like they did with the Franks, right? I'm telling you. Crazy. Now in Middle Persian, they call the Romans Hromayig, right? And this is taken, when you see the H, like in Georgian and Armenian and now in Persian, it comes from the actual Greek word for Roman, which is obviously Romei, but in ancient Greek would be Chromaioi, right? And so there's an H generally with that in the letter Ro. It's like Hr, and then Chromaioi, so Chromayig, right? So that's why you see the H in there. This comes from the Greek, not the Latin word for Roman. But here's the problem. The word Chromayig derives from Roman, and that's it. That's it. It doesn't mean just Roman and the Roman Empire, right? It's broadly a term for any place now east of Iran, right? So it could be just the West in general, Rome itself, or Greece. Doesn't matter. That's what it means now. Just like how Ionia didn't just mean the Ionian Greeks. It meant Greeks in general. It's the same thing here. It's a broader term. Yes, it came from the word for Roman, but it doesn't exactly translate exactly how it does in Greek or Latin. The Pahlavi papyri are documents written exclusively in Egypt during the Persian occupation or Sasanian occupation of Khosrow II. And this is between 619 and 629 AD. One of the fragments says this: Timaeus Chromayig, then Alexander Caesar. Timaeus the Roman said to his Caesar Alexander, and the Caesar Alexander did not become angry. This is referring to Alexander the Great, Alexander the Roman, Chromayig, right? So Alexander and his Greek compatriot Timaeus are called Romayig, right? And Alexander is called Caesar. Turaj Daryai, I'm probably butchering his name. Forgive me, I don't know any of the Iranian languages, but he's an Iranologist from Iran. He notes that this fragment matches the Sasanians' interpretation of Alexander as Chromayig, as a Roman. They always call him that in Sasanian literature. But then let's go forward, right? And we're going to go to some Zoroastrian texts. This is the book of Arda Viraf or Arda Viraznamag. And this is right in the beginning of chapter 1, part 1. Alexander I Chromayig, and then all the way down, Alexander I Chromayig. Translated, it is, instigated the accursed Alexander the Roman, who was dwelling in Egypt, so that he came to the country of Iran with severe cruelty and war and devastation. And he slew the ruler of Iran and destroyed the metropolis and empire and made them desolate. And this religion, namely all the Avesta and Zan, written upon prepared cowskins and with gold ink, was deposited in the archives, and Stakhar Papakan, and the hostility of the evil destined wicked Ashamuk, the evildoer, brought onward Alexander the Roman, who was dwelling in Egypt. And then in the letter of Tansar, the opening Tansar's letter to Gushnasp, it immediately says, when Alexander had taken the field in the region of the West and the Greek realms, an event too famous to need recounting, he had received the submission of Copts, Egyptians, and Berbers, and Jews. Then he led his army from there into Iran and joined battle with Darius. A band of Darius's own nobles used guile and treachery to behead him and brought the head to Alexander, who commanded that these men he nailed to trees as targets and used as butts for arrows. This being the manner of Greek justice, and he had it proclaimed, this is the reward for him who dares to kill a king. Intense, first off, intense. But now I don't have the Pahlavi text of this, but the translator of this, Mary Boyce, she actually writes about this in the notes. And it says, for Greece, Ibn Isfandiar regularly uses the word Rum, i.e. Rome, since Greece became part of the later Eastern Roman Empire. The word Rum is generally rendered in this translation by Greece, but on page 63, Rome, i.e. the Roman Empire, has been kept as more appropriate. So obviously it's using Rum to mean Rome. Now this isn't Middle Persian Romaig, right? This is beginning to be into New Persian, right? And it's influenced by Arabic. This is going to be noted later, an event too famous to need recounting. So clearly they know completely everything about Alexander the Great, okay? That's important. Now, the letter that this is based off of was originally from the 6th century, okay? And it was written in Persian, but later was translated into Arabic and then back into Persian by Ibn Isfandiyar. And he's a Mazandarani Iranian, which is just like Faria Fariji. And if you haven't watched Faria, it's like this, but for music. And he inspired me to grow my hair, and he's got a very sensual voice.
These videos are meant for history buffs, people interested in culture generally. I don't want this to be sort of an ivory tower thing where I only speak to the worthy who already know music theory. My point with these videos is that if you're just generally interested in history and you want to know a bit more about the history of music and you know nothing about music theory, then you can follow these videos.
I drink Sipuro to dull the pain of having to speak to you people.
Very amazing person. Watch him, please. His translation, though, is from around 1210 to 1216. And this is the only one we have. We don't have anything. This is the only version we have, is the one from the 12th century. There's also, though, Domenico Agostini, and he's an pre-Islamic Iranian professor, right? And he mentions that Romaig also refers in Iranian tradition to a person of both Byzantine and even Greek origin in certain contexts. And he gives the hypothesis for this, is that it's because of Imatio Alexandri in the Roman Empire, right? The kind of imitation of Alexander the Great by the Romans. And that he says that the Sasanians may have thought Alexander was actually a Roman, and they got confused, and they changed it. One reason being that in the letter of Tansar, Ardashir seems to attribute his wars against the Romans as vengeance against the successors of Alexander. Now, to me, this doesn't hold weight, and it's for a few reasons, especially when you realize that they knew about ancient Greece and Old Rome. If you actually read the letter, they do know the difference between Greece and Old Rome. They even say it in the letter, like I said before. It's an account that we don't need to retell it. Everyone knows this, right? So they were very, very close to Alexander, right? He made a big impact. And Greek was the official language of the Parthian Empire until the 1st century AD. So they knew the Greek language. They knew about Alexander. I think it's ridiculous to say that all of a sudden in the Sasanian era, they just completely forgot that he was Greek, and so they thought he was Roman because of Imitatio Alexandri. I mean, that to me makes no sense. No offense to Agostini. I think it's a bad idea that doesn't hold weight at all. By the way, this letter was written posthumously by Ardashir. It was based on a 3rd century letter, right? But it was a propaganda piece. This letter, the 6th century, even though it was based on a 3rd century one, it was a propaganda piece because of the wars between the Sasanians and the Byzantine Empire in the 6th century. So obviously they're trying to make it connected so that they can feel like they can get revenge, right? So we don't know in the very original, right, whether it's the original 6th century or even the one that is based off of. And we don't even know if Ardashir in the original even mentions Alexander. We don't know. So the earliest we can attest to Alexander being called a Roman or Romaig is in the 6th century. Agostini's second explanation is that they called him Roman because he was Greek, and the Romans at this time spoke Greek. So there you go. But again, we see that with the Armenians, which were part of Greater Iran, right, the Greater Iranian sphere of influence, they called them both Roman and Greek. So it wouldn't be hard to think that even the Sasanians saw them in the same way that the Armenians did. And then we have Denkard, the 9th or 10th century Zoroastrian compendium, right? And they say this from the Thinkers of the West, Book 4, Chapter 108. They use Horom Philosopha. So they call the Horom Philosopha, the philosophers of Rome. This is a note from Minu S. Southgate. She's talking about Eskandernameh. She says, the Byzantines, or the Eastern Roman Empire, was known as Rum during the rule of the Sasanian dynasty in the early Islamic era. The word Rum was used to mean Greece or Macedonia. Thus, by the Rumi Alexander, Alexander the Macedonian or the Greek is meant. That Eskandernameh is from 1194 to like 1202, I believe. So that's why Rum, we're seeing now Arabic influence, and instead of Rom, in New Persian, which this is written in, not Middle Persian anymore, the word for Roman is Urum, taken directly from the Arabic. So either way, in Persian, the word Romaig can mean Roman or Greek, at least with Alexander the Great. Now, the thing is, you go, well, what about before Alexander the Great? Well, the thing is, we don't hardly have anything about the Greeks, if at all, from the Achaemenid Persian era, like the Greco-Persian Wars. There's like nothing on that because there's hardly anything from this era about the Achaemenids, period. They hardly talk about their own period. The only time they talk about the Achaemenid Persian period is its fall with Alexander the Great. That's it. So we really don't have much to say of what they would call the Greeks like Leonidas or anyone else. Then Denkard, Book 3, Chapter 420. When the King Alexander of evil fame came to the country of Iran, the divine faith was a good deal harmed. All the writings preserved in the Dezina Pesht were burnt, and other writings which were in the Ganj-i-Shaspigan, I'm so sorry guys, passed into the hands of the Ottomans. Alexander had those translated into Greek. So I tried forever to find the Pahlavi text or the Latin transliteration, at least, of this chapter 420. I couldn't find it. So I don't know when it's translated into the language Greek what they mean. And if it meant Greek, then they know the difference. They know that Alexander spoke Greek, but they still call him Romaic. Then they did not believe it to be like Old Rome and be in Latin, right? If they use that word. Either way, here Greek means Roman. And we know this because, again, the Parthians drove out the Greeks and replaced Greek language as their official language in the 1st or 2nd century. They knew about Greek stuff. That's the thing, like this whole idea that, oh, they thought he was Roman. No, they knew about him because especially the Zoroastrians hated Alexander the Great, right? They hated him. But they definitely knew that he was Greek. They didn't think he was a Roman. Again, this is word concept fallacy. We're thinking that the word Roman for them means the same as it does for us. It doesn't. Because Alexander is just so important to Persian history, I totally doubt that they just all of a sudden forget that he was Greek or Macedonian and then just confuse him with being a Roman. They're like greatest adversary. It makes no sense at all. Especially in this earlier period, the Sasanian period. This isn't the like mid-medieval period. This is the Sasanian period we're talking about. I just doubt that so much. And considering now that the word Rum can mean any area east of Iran, it makes even more sense that they wouldn't view it as literally Roman as we do. Just stupid. But especially because for Greece, Middle Persian doesn't even have a name for it properly other than Romaig or Roma. That's the only word they have. But see this. In New Persian, which started around the 11th century, we do see this in a book, and it says that Philip is now called the king of Greece. Yunan, not Rum. According to the Persians, Dara asked for the daughter of Philkus, king of Greece, Philip, and took her from her. It should be said that he was a greedy person. He sent her to her father, not knowing that she was pregnant. When he is born, Philkus named him Alexander. They're talking about Dhul-Qarnayn, which is mentioned in the Quran, right? Alexander the Great. And they say, this is Alexander the Roman. And the Macedonians, they also say. So they know he's the king of Greece, but they say, this is Alexander the Roman. My two main sources for this, much of the Arab relations, is Byzantium View by the Arabs by Nadia Maria El-Sheikh, and one of her sources as well, which is the essay Rumi and Yunani Toward the Understanding of the Greek Language in the Muslim World by Nikolai Sarakov. And this essay is only found in the 1996 edition of East and West in the Crusader States, Contacts, Confrontations, Acta of the Congress held in Hernan Castle in May 1993. So that's the only one. I had to literally get the book to find it. Nikolai Sarakov writes, the Arabs chiefly called the Greeks either Al-Yunaniyuna or Al-Rum. The first term, obviously derived from the biblical name of the Greeks, Yonan, according to the common opinion, was used to define the ancient Greeks, while the second was mainly used for the modern Greeks or Byzantines. For the most part, Arabic sources refer to the Greek language as Al-Lugha Al-Yunaniya or Al-Lugha Al-Rumiya. But there was no clear division between these two languages, due to the polysemy of the ethnonym al-Rum, which could be applied to the Roman people from the ancient Romans up to the Spaniards and the Greeks/Byzantines as well. The word al-Rumiya could mean both Roman and Greek. In some cases, Arab authors saw no definitive difference between ancient and Byzantine Greek. For example, al-Mas'udi described the language of the Byzantines as identical to that of the ancient Greeks, but much more impoverished. Such narrower specifications as, for example, Old Yunaniya or the Greek language al-Greekiya are not as common. As we can see, the Arabs saw the Byzantines as Romans, full stop, okay? These are the people who definitely see them as truly, truly Romans in the sense of the word. And they refer to their language as either the Roman language or the Greek language, right? Probably more than any other nation. They explicitly state them as truly Roman, and they always do. They constantly do that. But he says they see them as Greek as well. But that's Sarakov presupposing that the Romans are Greeks. So it could just mean Roman full stop and not Greek. They do not truly see the Byzantines as Greeks like Sarakov claims, unless they relate them to the ancient Greeks, unless they connect them there. Then that means they viewed them as Greeks as well as Romans. At least have a few sources that talk about this, right? And one of them is Said al-Andalusi in his essay on the basic division between the nations. He says, Rome was the capital of the empire until 335, at which time Constantine, the son of Helena, adopted the religion of Christ, rejected that of the Sabaeans, and built on the Bosphorus a city bearing his name, Constantinople, a city situated at the center of the Greek world. This prince made this city his residence, and it remains until today the capital of the empire. Then it's again said, built a city on a gulf known as Al-Qustantiniya in the middle of the land of the Yunnan, which has remained the capital until this day. Clearly they see him as Romans, right? But they also believe that the ancient Greeks to be both in mainland Greece and Anatolia, because they say it was in the middle of the Yunnan, right? So they believe that the Greek speakers of Anatolia are Greeks in the sense of the word, the ancient word, because they generally mean Yunnan to mean ancient Greek. Now, sometimes when it comes to language, it gets confusing. It can even mean Syriac when it comes to language. I recommend actually reading Sarakov's essay on it to get the full explanation of the word Yunnan and Rumi, at least when it comes to languages. And because it's not online, I took pictures of the pages. I'll have it linked. Now, while Sarakov notes that some authors in the time, Arabic authors, use Rumi and Yunani interchangeably, both Sarakov and El-Sheikh, they both translate and mention the same passage from Al-Jahiz, and I'm going to use the one from Sarakov specifically because it seems like a more true translation. It's less condensed. It's much more literal, right? And the only difference is, though, Rum in El-Sheikh is the people, and in Sarakov's, it means it to be the language. I don't know which one is more accurate, but Sarakov is a linguist, but El-Sheikh is a native Arabic speaker. But I don't think it's that much important, but just keep that in mind and see yourself if it does change the context of what's being said here. But according to El-Sheikh, it comes from his work, The Refutation on the Christians, okay? It is commonly known that the Christians, al-Nasara, and the Byzantines, al-Rum, have neither art nor clear opinion and consideration. They just possess the art of turning, wood cutting, painting, and silk weaving. I've excluded them from the ranks of the Udaba and removed them from the assembly of philosophers and wise men, because the Kitab al-Mantiq wa il-Qawn wa il-Fasad and the Kitab al-Ulwi by Aristotle was not written in Rumi nor by Christians. And the Almagest by Ptolemy, it is not written in Rumi nor by a Christian. And Kitab ul-Qaidus by Euclid was not written in Rumi nor by a Christian. The same applies to the Kitab al-Tib by Galen, who did not write in Rumi and was no Christian. MashaAllah, Habibi. And likewise the books by Democritus, Hippocrates, Plato, and so on. These are people from a certain nation, which is El-Yunaniyuna, and the traces of their wisdom have remained. Their creed is not that of the others, i.e. Al-Nasara and Al-Rum, and their education is not theirs either. These Yunaniyuna are scholars, and those Rum, the artisans, have taken their books because of their proximity and nearest to them. And from these books they have taken certain things for themselves and adopted them for their community. But they could not change the fact that this well-known and celebrated literature and wisdom was the work of the Yunani Yuna and not them. They affirmed that the Yunani Yuna comprise a tribe, Kabil, of the Rum, and because of their creed, they boast of their superiority over the Jews, behave arrogantly towards the Arabs, and exalt themselves over the Indians. They say, our sages surpass your sages, and our philosophers have been imitated by your philosophers. El-Sheikh comments on this passage in page 104. She says, this Phil-Hellenic and anti-Byzantine attitude has been explained most recently as stemming from contemporaneous events, the state of total warfare that Al-Mamin had initiated against the Byzantines. Dimitri Hutas suggests that the Byzantines were portrayed as deserving Muslim attack not only because they were infidels, but because they were also culturally benighted and inferior, both to Muslims and their own ancestors, the Greeks. This interpretation suggests that the Muslims saw themselves as superior due to their adherence to Islam and their appreciation of ancient Greek science and wisdom, which they were translating into Arabic. But in both translations, El-Sheikh's and Sarakov's, we see two important things. The Muslims deny their connection to the Greeks for religious reasons, and that's because many Muslims were being persuaded by the Byzantines and the Christians. And that's why this propaganda piece had to come about, to stop people from saying, no, they're not related, they're just stupid, they're not like the stuff that we love to learn about. They're not related to them. And secondly, that according to the Muslims, the Byzantines themselves claim to be Greek, right? Because they were saying, oh, they believe that these works are theirs and that the Yunani are a tribe of the Rum. So they're talking in terms that Muslims and Arabic speakers would understand in terms of tribes. But they're basically saying that the Byzantines themselves claim that they were Greeks, right? They were saying, our sages, you imitate and copy our sages. Sages meaning philosophers, right? So basically, they're doing the exact opposite of what happened in the West, right? They're going, no, we're Romans to the Westerners, and they're saying, no, we're Greeks to the Romans. That's basically what this is saying. And actually, they did that with the West once it became cool to be Greek again in the late medieval period. They did the exact same thing. But again, sometimes they're praised, the Byzantines, for being philosophers, sages, and smart men for their wisdom. And then other times, they absolutely hate them and they say they're dog shit and they're stupid. So it really depends on the relations between them. It got really sour during the middle period when the Byzantines went on the offense, right, with Basil and especially Emperor Nikephoros, because Nikephoros was known as the White Death of the Saracens. So yeah, that's when it gets really, really insulting. So when they're losing the wars, they say the exact opposite, that they're stupid, and that it's basically when they became Christian, that's when they lost all their wisdom, right? And then they start saying they don't deserve to be called Greeks, and they're actually descendants of Esau in the Bible. And so, yeah, it gets weird. Said al-Andalusi states that the Romans had in Rome and other towns eminent sages and learned men well-versed in the different branches of philosophy. He finds fault with the common assertion that the celebrated philosophers were Rum or Roman, noting the truth is that they are Yunan, ancient Greeks. And I'm Lebanese too, okay, so it totally reminds me of an Arabic. The truth is that they are not the Rum, they're Yunan, okay? However, due to the contact between these two nations, namely the Yunan and the Rum, and to their close proximity of their countries, and due to the transfer of power from one to the other, the two became one country and one united empire, so that the Rum and the Greeks were amalgamated, and it became difficult to distinguish between the philosophers of the two nations. Those who possess sound knowledge of history and know the biographies of great men believe that both of these nations were famous for their interest in philosophy. Nevertheless, the ancient Greeks enjoyed a distinction and a superiority in this respect that was contested neither by the Rum nor by anyone else. And then occasionally, medieval Islamic sources, they do confuse and use Rum to mean ancient Greece as well. But this is rare. It's kind of, I would say, the exact opposite of how it was in Georgian, where Saberzneti occasionally meant Rome, but mainly meant Greek and Greece. It's the opposite here. And it's not hard to see because now we see that they viewed them as an amalgamation of the both. The two became one, right? So that's how they use it. So it's not surprising that they would confuse it occasionally. And so it seems like in times of war more than anything else, they came out with these crazy exaggerated claims about the Byzantines being the sons of hairy Esau, and they destroyed the ancient Greeks once Constantine came around. But at the same time, they go the complete opposite and accept their relation to the Greeks when they're at times of more peace. So it definitely depends, but clearly much more Roman. This is from Sarakov. Due to the fact that the major part of the Greek heritage borrowed by the Arab was related to the sciences, the Unani words, whether Greek or Syriac, appear to have been chiefly scientific as well. This phenomenon found acknowledgement in the widespread Arab view of the Unani Yuna as philosophers, or as a philosophical sect as well. Even a modern philosopher, mathematician, and doctor, Kusta ibn Luka, who was a Melkite Christian, and Melkite in this sense doesn't mean like Melkite Catholic, but basically was loyal to the Byzantine Emperor, loyal to the Roman Emperor, right? And he was born in Heliopolis in modern-day Lebanon. Lebanese, bro. Yeah. He wrote and translated works into Arabic, Aramaic, and Greek, okay? And he was called by Al-Andalusi Unani. He was called Unani. He is mentioned after Greek philosophers, followers of Aristotle, among the modern philosophers, Unani Yuna. So Sarakov notes that they use Unani even though he was a Christian, right? In other instances, especially with Arabic-speaking Christians, Unani is synonymous with Hellene, and thus could also mean pagan. So it's much more synonymous, the word, in the Arab Christian world, right? Where Unani is literally a translation of Hellene and can mean ancient Greek or even pagan, right? And then there was one commentator of Ibn al-Baitar, when translating into Greek words, he says that one word went in accordance with what he heard in the land of the Unani Yuna. So the Arabic view, or more specifically Islamic view of the Byzantines, was very complicated. It ranged from denying them being Greeks completely all the way to them being the land of the Greeks. But regardless, whether they didn't see them as Greek or Greek, they always, without exception, saw them as Romans. Even if it is degraded Romans because they became Christian, they saw them as degraded Greeks or degraded Romans most of the time. And this makes sense. The religious tensions were huge. And it changes and softens up after the West comes in the Crusades. Because before, at this time, they were the only really enemy that was Christian. So it's worse. But I think it's notable that when insulting them, they deny the Byzantines' claim to their Greek heritage, right? Now, I did say I would come back to Simon Franklin and the Rus again, and here it is. Now, I would recommend reading this in full, and it's called The Empire of the Romaioi as Viewed from Kievan Russia by Simon Franklin. And this is what he says. This is very important, and he poses a very important question. This is important. In translating the Chronicle of George the Monk, which was a Roman, he wrote in Greek, Romaioi, or Romei, before Constantine, they translated it to Roman. And then after Constantine is where they use the word Greek. Yeah. So we know this isn't word concept fallacy we're doing, because they translated Romei to Roman, Rimsky, and then after Constantine, Greki. Whoa. Talking about Aurelian, it's Roman. Talking about Julian, it's Greek. Talking about Hadrian and Julius Caesar, it's Roman. Talking about Constantine and after, it's Greek. So when they say Greek, they do not mean Roman. They mean Greek in the full meaning of the word, because they literally use Roman before Constantine and Greek after. That's as deliberate as it gets. And that's in translating the word Romei. They saw the context of the word Romei, whoever knew Greek and Slavic, and they translated it differently. Franklin also notes something and poses what I think is an extremely important question, right? He says, we possess both the Greek and Slavic texts of the canonical responses of John II, who was the Metropolitan of Kiev during the 1080s. Surely, in the work of a Byzantine Metropolitan, one would expect the correct image of Byzantium to be assiduously maintained. Not so. Even here, the only reference to Iromaiki Politia is converted to Grieskoye Zhitie. John II, Metropolitan of Kiev, was originally from Constantinople. He was a native Greek speaker, okay? And he makes a fair point. If it was that horrific of an insult and factually wrong to call them Greeks, why would the Rus, who copy them in architecture, follow them in their faith, and thought of them as responsible for them receiving salvation and wanting to be like them, even their armor is close to Byzantine in style, right? Why would they do that? If they saw what happened in the West and it completely shattered relationships, Why would they do this intentionally if that's what they were mad about with the West, being called Greeks? If it was calling them Greeks that shattered the relationships with the West, why would the Rus deliberately go out of their way and call them Greeks after knowing that, especially because their conversion, they went to the West. They didn't like the liturgy and the Mass, the Catholic Mass. They went to the East and we thought we were in heaven. Why would they do that? Makes no sense. The same goes too for the Norse. Why would the Varangian guards, who swear their life to protect the emperor and point of death and never abandon him, never betray him, why would they call him a word that is so insulting it's like a racial slur? Be like calling a black guy the N-word with a hard R, right? Like, you wouldn't do that if you were protecting. It'd be like Obama's security, like, protect the, like, no one would say that, right? Like, why would these guys simultaneously swear loyalty in their lives to a man and intentionally misname him to the point of facing legal punishment? Why would they do that? The answer is so simple, but many people miss it. It's context. The Byzantines did not hate being called Greeks, okay? They hated being called Greeks from the West because when the West said it, they were denying they were Romans. And in that letter that got them so mad, the Byzantines, to where they threw the papal legates in prison, was because it called Otto emperor of the Romans and Nicephorus emperor of the Greeks. That's why they got so mad. Not just being called Greek is what got them mad. Because since we've seen here, everyone called them Greeks. Even the people that called them Romans called them Greeks. And some people didn't even call them Romans at all. And they called them Greeks. And none of them got mad. They never had an issue with that. It was only when the West did, because of the connotation of when they used the term Greek, it meant something else. This isn't hard to understand, but I have no idea why no one seems again like, he said, I'm not the emperor of the Greeks, I'm emperor of the Romans, and they got mad, so they must hate being called Greeks. No, that's not what happened. I'm sorry, it's just, it's such an, it's obvious, man. I'm not saying that Greek and Roman are synonymous. Obviously not. If it was literally synonymous, then they wouldn't use the word Hellenes at all to refer to ancient Greeks, and they wouldn't get mad when they call them emperor of the Greeks, because they'd be like, that just means Roman, so ha ha ha. They're not saying that, and it's not the opposite, where the word Greek in the other countries was synonymous with Roman, as we've seen even with the Rus, where they were the most deliberate about the difference, and the Byzantines never cared about it. And too, we have to remember that the word Greek, Grekus, had some negative connotations in the West, in Latin, right? So even Cicero was called a Grecus, and it was like an insult, right? And then there's the word Greculus, which in Greek, still to this day, Grekulos, which is more of an insult, right? It used to be someone who used to imitate Greeks, and then now it's like a lesser Greek, right? You call them Grekulos, right? So obviously, the word had different connotations, kind of like how, depending on how you call someone a Jew, can be just a fact or an insult. In the same way that in World War II, calling someone a German could be used like an insult, in the same way that Jew could be, right? Yes, it's the name for them, but depending on the context and the person who says it and how they say it, it can mean a lot more. So it's the same thing here. Again, I am just showing you what the others saw them as, not how the Byzantines, the Romans themselves saw them. We're just talking about their neighbors here. The Catholic Frankish West saw them as Greeks, and Greeks only, not Romans. The NORDS saw them as Greeks. The Rus definitely saw them as Greeks. The Bulgarians saw them as Greeks. The Georgians saw them as Greeks, but also as Romans. The Armenians saw them as both Romans and Greeks. The Persians saw them as Romans, but Greeks as well. And the Arabs saw them as Romans, and occasionally as Greeks as well. And when we look at everyone else, right, we see that not only do they call them Greeks or acknowledge them as Greeks, but a lot of them call them predominantly Greeks, not just the Catholic Frankish West. Now, I'm not saying that this is what the Byzantines thought of themselves as. I'm only referring to how others view them, right? And most of them view them as Greeks on top of Romans. The only ones who ever denied their Greekness were the Arabs, and that was only on occasion. The other times they do. And it only seemed to bother the Romans when it came from the papal West and not everybody else. Knowing that, would it be that everybody, friend and ally or foe, misname them completely except for one of their greatest enemies? Or is it that we do not understand what it meant to be Roman in the Roman Empire in the medieval period? But that's a different topic for another video. So yeah, I just wanted this to be mainly a response to Romaboo ramblings and clear things up. Again, I really like Romaboo's videos. I love when a new video comes out. But this one was shockingly misinformed to the point where it was either just from reading a secondary source to things that were completely not true at all, like the Romei and the Slavs calling them Romans. So that was a little shocking. I hope he sees this. I don't mean this to be an insult to you, dude. Again, love your videos. Just, I think we need to be more cautious and see firsthand sources as well as secondary sources when we're discussing these things, because otherwise we're going to have a very wrong view on the total opposite end of the spectrum, from the people who denied the Greeks, like the Western scholars and academics who only want to call them Byzantine because that was an insulting word and it denied their Romanness, to the point now where it's a reaction is going to the opposite extreme. We're calling them Romans now, but the idea of what a Roman is wrong as well. Again, love Romaboo's videos. I'm in the pro-Roman camp. Anthony Caldelis is. Romaboo Ramblings is. But again, I think those two go a little too far with it, or at least they're not fully understanding what it meant to be a Roman in those days. But I'm not going to talk about that again today. This was just about the neighbors. The next time I will talk about the view of the Romans according to themselves. Because trust me, there was, in that video on the B word, there was a lot of stuff wrong with that too. So, yeah. But it's okay. It's okay. We're here to learn. If you're from the old channel, it's great seeing you here and following me. Papa bless. And if you're new here, welcome aboard. I got a lot new cool topics to talk about, a lot of cool theories, especially when it comes to the medieval Roman military. So look out for those. Subscribe if you're not. And I will see you on the next video. Adio. Oh my gosh. I hope that turned out. I hope to God that turned out.